The wealthy heiress chose the fat blacksmith, and her family swore to destroy them both. "Marry him, and you'll have no daughter," William Ashford said, each word struck like a hammer on an anvil. "Choose that fat blacksmith, and I will burn your future to the ground." Spring had just laid its soft green hand on Riverside in 1875. The street outside Brennan Forge smelled of hot iron and river mist, horses stamping, a church bell carrying across cottonwoods. Inside, fire breathed through the mouth of the furnace, and Thomas Brennan, broad as a doorframe, soot-smeared steady, lifted his tongs and set the orange lock plate beneath his hammer. Sparks bloomed around him like fireflies. In the doorway, Eleanor Ashford held herself very straight, as if breeding and etiquette could shield a heart in open revolt. The old jewelry box from her grandmother lay beside the tools, its lock gutted, its history asking for a gentle hand. Rumor had already begun its crawl along the boardwalks. A wealthy heiress had been seen at the forge. A giant of a man had bent close to something delicate, and his voice had not been coarse at all. People laughed in doorways. They always do. They laughed right up until William Ashford's carriage halted at the hitching post and a father's love hardened into threat. The furnace sighed. The town held its breath. Eleanor Ashford had never known the meaning of no. Born into silks and summer estates, she grew up beneath chandeliers, learning which fork to use before she could ride a horse. From her window, she could see the roofs of Riverside, the smoke rising from the forges and bakeries where the working men toiled. Her mother used to say, "A lady should never smell of smoke." Eleanor had always wondered why that sounded less like advice and more like a warning. At 23, she was the only daughter of William Ashford, the wealthiest landowner on the western bank of the Missouri. Suitors lined up like investors, each more polished, colder, emptier than the last. She smiled through dinners, through rehearsed compliments, through the life carved out for her. Inside, she carried a quiet rebellion that her corsets could never hide. When her grandmother passed away, Eleanor found in the will a small locked jewelry box, the only thing she truly wanted. The key had been lost decades ago. Her father told her to have one of the estate's men break it open, but she refused. "It belonged to her heart," she said softly. "It should be opened by hands that understand care." That was how she walked, unchaperoned, into Brennan Forge on a cool March morning. The moment she stepped inside, her world tilted. The air was thick with heat and iron and something raw. Honesty, perhaps. She saw him, a man built like the furnace itself, his shirt damp with sweat, hair wild, shoulders broad enough to hold the sky. His hands, though, were not brutal. They moved with the precision of an artist, shaping metal as though it were clay. Thomas Brennan looked up, and the clamor of the hammer died. For an instant, Eleanor saw surprise, then shame, flicker across his face. People looked at him that way, then looked away. But she didn't. She met his gaze, blue meeting brown, curiosity meeting disbelief. When she spoke, her voice was gentle, unguarded. "I was told you mend things no one else can." And in that single sentence, a life of walls began to crack. Thomas Brennan had never been invisible, though he often wished he were. In Riverside, his size made him a spectacle. Children whispered the giant when he passed. Drunk men muttered the bear outside saloons. He bore their words like he bore the weight of his hammer, silently, until the noise dulled into background ache. He had inherited Brennan Forge from his father, along with the debt, the tools, and the calluses. 5 years earlier, fever had taken both his parents, leaving him with a shop full of silence and a loneliness that clung like soot. He worked day and night until the ache in his hands drowned the ache in his chest. Thomas didn't believe in luck. He believed in metal, honest, stubborn, unyielding. Metal never lied about its nature. Fire either broke it or shaped it, and he had learned to read which way it would go. So when Eleanor Ashford entered his forge, all gold hair and blue eyes, he thought she had lost her way. Women like her didn't cross the tracks that divided the town. Yet she stood before him, holding an old box, like it was something sacred. Her voice had the softness of linen, but her words were steady. "It was my grandmother's. I'd like it fixed if it can be." He took it from her carefully, his thick fingers clumsy around the delicate brass. For once, he was afraid to breathe too hard. "It can," he said after a pause. "It'll take a few days." She thanked him, and he nodded, already expecting never to see her again. But she returned, once to ask about the repair, another time just to bring tea on a windy afternoon. She sat near the furnace and listened while he explained how heat and patience could bend even the hardest iron. Her laughter filled the forge like sunlight through smoke. And for the first time in years, Thomas found himself speaking more than he planned. He told her about his parents, about how he learned to work metal, about the songs his mother used to hum to the rhythm of his hammer. When she left that evening, she forgot her silk handkerchief on the counter. Thomas picked it up, brushing the edge between his thumb and finger. He could still smell her perfume, lavender and courage. He folded it carefully, as though it might break, and whispered to the empty forge, "She said I mend things no one else can, but who'll mend me?" Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor kept finding reasons to return. Sometimes she brought a broken clasp or an old trinket. Other times, nothing at all. Only questions about the way fire obeyed Thomas, about the rhythm of the hammer, about why he always hummed when he worked. He grew used to her presence, the rustle of her skirts near the anvil, the way her perfume cut through the smell of smoke and iron. At first, he feared she pitied him, but pity faded quickly when she began helping, steadying tongs, holding a candle while he traced filigree into soft metal. No one had ever stood beside him at the forge before. Outside, gossip spread like sparks on dry hay. A blacksmith and a lady, a scandal in the making. Thomas heard the laughter when he went to buy supplies. Eleanor heard the whispers at her father's table, yet neither turned away. One afternoon, a storm rolled over Riverside, thunder shaking the roof like war drums. Eleanor had been caught on her way to the forge, rain plastering her hair to her cheeks. When she burst through the door, dripping and breathless, Thomas simply handed her his coat without a word. She smiled, shivering, and sat near the fire while he stoked it higher. The storm howled, and they stayed there through the evening, two souls marooned by circumstance. She spoke of her mother's quiet sorrow, of the weight of a last name that felt more like a chain. He told her about the winter he buried his parents, how he'd promised himself never to need anyone again. When lightning flashed through the cracks of the shutters, Eleanor startled, and he reached out instinctively, his massive hand covering hers. Her skin was soft, trembling. His hand was warm, steady. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. That night was their silent bond. Rain against the roof, firelight flickering over two faces that had stopped pretending. From that evening on, their world shrank to the size of the forge. She learned to cook over his small iron stove. He repaired a music box for her, so its melody joined the clang of his hammer. When her fine gloves tore, she didn't replace them. Her hands grew stronger, surer, burned in places where sparks kissed her skin. One morning, as sunlight spilled across the dusty windows, Eleanor caught his reflection in the brass mirror he used for polishing. She didn't see the bulk or the scars the town mocked. She saw patience carved into every line of his face, gentleness in the eyes that had stopped expecting kindness. Thomas noticed her staring. "What is it?" he asked, self-conscious. "Nothing," she said, smiling faintly. "I just realized something." "What's that?" "That I was wrong all my life about what beauty looks like." He froze, unsure how to breathe. She reached up, touching the soot on his cheek with her thumb, and whispered, "It looks like this." From that moment, there was no turning back. Their love was not loud or hurried. It was forged, one heartbeat at a time, in the rhythm of hammers and rain. Autumn came early that year, painting the valley in amber and smoke. For months, Eleanor and Thomas had lived in their quiet rhythm. Work, laughter, silence, love folded between the moments like pages in a secret book. But peace in small towns never lasts when pride and rumor have fuel to burn. The first spark came from Cornelius Blackwood, son of a neighboring estate and the man Eleanor had been meant to marry. His pride was a delicate thing, easily bruised and never forgotten. When word reached him that the Ashford heiress was spending her days with a blacksmith, his humiliation turned to fury. He rode to the Ashford manor, fed her father's anger with poisoned words. "Your daughter shames your name. The forge has become her palace, and the brute her king." William Ashford's face blanched with rage. By dusk, his orders were clear. Eleanor was to be brought home, and the blacksmith dealt with. That night, shadows moved around Brennan Forge. 3 hired men smashed windows and overturned benches. Thomas woke to the sound of glass breaking. He rushed out, fists bare, shouting into the dark. A club struck his shoulder, another tore through his cheek. He fought them off, but by dawn the forge lay half ruined, embers cold beneath the rain. Eleanor arrived just as he collapsed against the doorframe. Her cry cut through the morning like a blade. She tore her shawl to bind his wounds, her hands shaking. "They'll come again," Thomas rasped. "You should go home." "I have no home but here," she whispered. 2 days later, her father came in person, Cornelius at his side, flanked by armed men. They stood in the muddy street before the half-burned forge. The town gathered in uneasy silence. "Eleanor Ashford," her father's voice thundered, "you will leave this place now." She stepped forward, mud splashing the hem of her once elegant gown. "No, father," Cornelius sneered. "He'll drag you into the gutter. You think the world will forgive a lady who lies with a beast?" Thomas clenched his fists, blood seeping through the bandages. "I never asked her for anything," he said, voice low but steady. "But I will fight for her, even if I lose everything." Eleanor's eyes shone. She moved to stand beside him. "You won't lose me." Then, facing her father, her voice rose, trembling but sure. "If love is a crime, then let it be mine. I would rather live one day with truth than a lifetime with your lies." The crowd gasped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. William Ashford's fury wavered. His daughter's defiance struck deeper than any insult. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Cornelius lunged forward, but Thomas met him halfway, seizing his wrist midair. The blacksmith's strength was quiet, unstoppable. "Go home, boy," he said. "You've already lost." Cornelius yanked free and spat in the dirt. "This isn't over." But the townspeople were no longer silent. Someone cheered. Another clapped. In a place where love was rare and cruelty common, courage was contagious. When the Ashford carriage finally rolled away, the forge stood battered but unbroken, just like them. Winter found them rebuilding what anger had tried to destroy. Together, they swept the ashes, hammered new hinges, replaced shattered glass. The forge smelled once again of smoke and steel, but now also of bread. Eleanor had learned to bake in the same fire that once frightened her. They married quietly that February in a small chapel outside town. No silk gowns or polished shoes, only a white ribbon in Eleanor's hair, and a plain gold band Thomas had forged himself. When the priest asked for witnesses, 2 townsfolk stepped forward, a widow he'd repaired a gate for, and the boy who delivered coal to the forge. Their vows were simple: to stand when storms came, to hold when the world turned cold. They moved into the small cottage behind the forge. Eleanor tended a garden where roses grew through blackened soil. Thomas carved her a rocking chair out of oak. Their life was hard, but honest. Each dawn he lit the furnace. Each dusk she waited at the door with supper and a smile that made every wound worth carrying. Sometimes, when she looked at her rough-handed husband bent over the anvil, she felt the ache of what she'd left behind, the marble halls, the comfort, the certainty. But then he'd glance up, eyes full of warmth and quiet devotion, and the ache dissolved into gratitude. Years passed, measured not by wealth, but by small mercies. A repaired plow that fed a family the first bloom in spring, laughter shared over burnt bread. And in the summer of 1877, as the forge glowed under the evening sun, Eleanor placed his calloused hand over her growing belly. He froze. "Truly?" She nodded, tears glinting like sparks. "You're going to be a father." For a man who'd been mocked all his life, it was the first time he felt chosen, not by pity, not by need, but by love itself. When the child came, the forge fell silent for 3 days. Then, on a quiet dawn, the cry of a newborn rose above the river's mist. Thomas stood by the window, their son in his arms, Eleanor resting behind him. "Look," she whispered, voice thin but full of wonder. "The light's coming back." And it was. Over the roof, over the river, over the town that once sneered at them, sunlight spilled like forgiveness. Time softened what pride had hardened. Word of their peace reached Riverside, and even those who had once mocked began to speak their names with a gentler tone. William Ashford arrived one spring morning, his hair grayer, his cane tapping against the stones of the rebuilt forge. For a long moment he stood at the doorway, watching his daughter rock a cradle beside the furnace, and the giant man tending a fire that burned steady, not fierce. He took off his hat. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I thought I was protecting you from shame. Instead, I chained you away from joy." She rose and embraced him. "Father," she murmured, "I found both joy and pride here, just not the kind you wanted." William turned to Thomas, hesitation trembling in his hands. "I judged you by the eyes of men," he admitted, "but I see now how wrong they were." Thomas, who had waited his whole life for dignity, offered it first. He extended his soot-streaked hand. "Then let's start again." And they did. As years passed, the forge became a landmark, not for the metal it shaped, but for the story it carried, a tale of love that melted scorn and molded forgiveness. Travelers stopped to buy trinkets engraved with a single line Eleanor had written and Thomas had etched onto brass. Beauty is the work of hands that never stop believing. Stories like theirs remind us that strength is not in what the world applauds, but in what two hearts build when no one is watching. That kindness, like iron, becomes unbreakable only after it's been through fire. Evening settled over Riverside once more. The forge, rebuilt from ruin, glowed against the twilight. Thomas sat outside, his son asleep in his arms, the air carrying the scent of iron and roses. Eleanor leaned against the doorway, her hair touched with silver, her smile still the same one that had first disarmed him years ago. Behind them, the furnace hummed softly, no longer a place of toil, but of legacy. Each flicker of flame was a memory, the first spark of love, the night of the storm, the mornings rebuilt from ashes. Their story had begun with a hammer strike and a whisper of defiance, and it ended here, in the peace they had forged together. Some nights, passers-by still spoke of the blacksmith and the heiress who defied a family, a town, a world too proud to see that love, once kindled, can outlast every prejudice. And if you listen closely, the forge still sings, a low, rhythmic heartbeat reminding anyone who pauses to hear, love does not need permission to exist. So if you've stayed until this moment, through every spark and silence, through every trial and tenderness, tell me, where are you listening from tonight?